The widow faced a rope at auction until a child shouted, "She saved me." The rope scratched against Sarah McKenna's neck like the devil's own whisper. Below the gallows platform, Cedar Falls had turned out in Sunday clothes to watch a widow hang, their faces bright with the kind of excitement that came from seeing justice served with entertainment on the side. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice boomed across the town square like a preacher calling sinners to salvation. "Before we proceed with the execution of Sarah McKenna for the cold-blooded murder of Jacob Morse, we'll be conducting a special auction of her worldly possessions." Hiram Blackwood adjusted his black coat and gold watch chain, every inch the traveling showman who'd made his fortune selling death as spectacle. He'd arrived in town 3 days ago with a wagon full of ropes and a ledger full of names. Towns where hangings drew crowds and crowds drew money. Sarah's hands were bound behind her, but her eyes swept the gathered faces with the fierce clarity of a woman who'd already made peace with dying. She found what she was looking for in the third row, a small figure pressed against Mrs. Patterson's skirts, trying to make herself invisible. Annie Chun, 12 years old, Chinese, and the only person in Cedar Falls who knew the truth. "Now then," Blackwood continued, pulling items from a wooden crate, "we'll start with the deceased's wedding dress. Pure white silk, barely worn. Who'll give me $5? "3," called out Jim Morrison, the bank clerk whose wife had been eyeing Sarah's belongings since the arrest. "4," shouted Mary Caldwell from across the square. Sarah closed her eyes as her most precious possessions became fodder for the crowd's bloodlust. The wedding dress Daniel had saved 2 years' wages to buy, the china tea set that had belonged to her mother, the carved wooden cross Daniel had made with his own hands the winter before the claimed jumpers killed him, sold to Mrs. Caldwell for $6. Blackwood's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Next item, a genuine gold locket, engraved with the initials S and D, perfect for sweethearts." The locket had held Daniel's photograph and a lock of hair from their stillborn son. Now strange hands pawed at it like vultures picking over carrion. Through the crowd's excited chatter, Sarah heard a small voice whisper, "No." Annie Chen's dark eyes were fixed on the platform, her thin hands clenched into fists at her sides. The girl had witnessed everything that night 3 months ago, had hidden in Sarah's root cellar when Jacob Morse came calling with blood on his hands and lies on his tongue. $8. The bidding for the locket grew fierce. Men who'd never spoken to Sarah in life now competed to own pieces of her heart. Going once, going twice, sold to Mayor Hutchins for $12. Sarah's jaw tightened. Hutchins had been the first to call for her hanging after Morse's body was found in her barn, the same barn where she'd been hiding Annie and her father Wong Chun from the mob that wanted to drive all Chinese from the territory. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the main event. Blackwood's voice rose to a theatrical crescendo. The condemned woman herself, who'll bid for the privilege of pulling the lever that sends Sarah McKenna to meet her maker? A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. This was new territory, even for a town that had grown comfortable with frontier justice, served rough and ready. $20. Jacob Morse's brother Robert thrust his hand into the air, his face flushed with whiskey and righteousness. $20 to see justice done proper. $25, shouted Frank Morrison, for the honor of Cedar Falls. Sarah's stomach turned to ice. They were auctioning off her death, like a prize hog at the county fair. She'd known Cedar Falls was a hard town, carved from unforgiving land by unforgiving people, but she'd never imagined they'd sink to this depth. Annie Chin stepped forward, pushing through the crowd with desperate purpose. Mrs. Patterson grabbed for the girl's arm, but Annie slipped away like water through fingers. She reached the edge of the platform just as the bidding hit $30. She didn't do it. Annie's voice cut through the noise like a knife through silk. The crowd fell silent, 200 faces turning toward the small Chinese girl who dare to speak against white man's justice. Robert Morse's face went red as a bull's hide. Get that China girl out of here. This ain't no concern of hers. $40, called another voice, trying to restart the bidding and drown out Annie's words. But Sheriff Tom Bradley stepped forward, his hand raised for quiet. He was an old man, worn thin by 20 years of keeping peace in a town that seemed determined to tear itself apart over gold and grudges. "What did you say, child?" His voice was gentle, but his eyes were hard as flint. Annie's whole body trembled like a leaf in winter wind, but her voice stayed steady. "Mrs. McKenna didn't kill Mr. Morse. I saw what really happened that night." The crowd erupted like a kicked anthill. Voices rose in anger and disbelief, while others demanded to hear what the girl had to say. Through it all, Sarah watched Annie with a mixture of pride and terror. The child was signing her own death warrant to save a woman who'd already made peace with dying. Lying little heathen. Robert Morse pushed toward the platform. "Chinese can't testify against whites. It's the law." "Maybe so," Sheriff Bradley said, his weathered hand dropping to his gun. "But I reckon I'd like to hear what she has to say before we proceed with any rope pulling." Blackwood's face darkened like a storm cloud. A delayed hanging meant delayed payment, and delayed payment was bad for business. "Sheriff, the court has already rendered its verdict. The woman was tried and convicted fair and square by a jury that never heard all the evidence," Annie said, her young voice carrying across the suddenly quiet square. "Mrs. McKenna didn't kill nobody. She was trying to save me and my papa when Mr. Morse came hunting us with fire and blood." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The child was telling the truth, but truth had a way of getting people killed in Cedar Falls, especially people with the wrong color skin and not enough money to buy justice. The rope around her neck felt heavier with each passing moment, while the crowd waited to see whether a Chinese girl's word could stop a white woman's hanging. The silence stretched thin as piano wire until Sheriff Bradley cleared his throat like a man preparing for his own funeral. "Speak your piece, child, but speak it true." Annie's dark eyes found Sarah's, drawing strength from the woman who'd risked everything to shelter her family. "It started 3 months ago, when the white men came to burn our camp by Willow Creek." Sarah's memory flooded back to that terrible night. She'd been walking home from evening church services when she heard the screams, high and desperate, cutting through the mountain air like knives. By the time she reached the creek, half the Chinese miners' camp was already in flames. My Papa Wong Chun, he worked the played-out claims nobody else wanted. Annie continued, her voice steady despite the hostile faces surrounding her. "Found gold where white folks said there wasn't none. Made some men angry." Robert Morse stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. "That China camp was built on stolen land. My brother Jacob had every right to clear them out. With fire." Annie's question hung in the air like smoke from a burning building. "With guns and ropes." Sarah remembered Daniel's last letter, written just days before he died. He discovered Jacob Morse was running claim jumpers through the territory, driving out legal miners and selling their rights to railroad interests. But Daniel had died before he could present his evidence to the territorial judge. "Tell them about that night," Sarah called out, her voice hoarse from the rope's pressure. "Tell them what you saw." Annie nodded, her small hands clenched tight. "Mrs. McKenna found me and Papa hiding in the rocks after our camp burned. We was hurt bad. Papa had bullet wounds, and I had burns on my arms from pulling him out of our tent." The crowd shifted restlessly. Some faces showed shame, but others hardened like winter ground. Cedar Falls had built its prosperity on gold claims, and questions about how those claims were obtained threatened every family in town. "She took us to her place," Annie continued. "Hid us in the root cellar under her kitchen. Fed us, doctored our wounds, never asked for nothing in return." Sarah's throat tightened with memory. Annie's father had been dying slowly from infected bullet wounds, whispering Chinese prayers Sarah couldn't understand, but recognized as a man preparing to meet his maker. She'd done what any Christian woman would do, shown mercy to strangers in need. Mr. Jacob Morse came calling 2 weeks later, Annie said, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Middle of the night, drunk and angry, demanding Papa tell him where the gold was hid. Lies, Robert Morse shouted. My brother was a God-fearing man. He wouldn't terrorize no woman. But Sheriff Bradley held up his hand for quiet, his weathered face grave as a tombstone. Let the girl finish. Annie's next words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for months. Mrs. McKenna tried to protect us, told Mr. Morse we wasn't there. But he pushed past her, started tearing up the house, looking for Papa's gold. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering Jacob Morse's face that night, flushed with whiskey and twisted with greed. He'd kicked over her furniture, smashed her dishes, torn apart everything Daniel had built with loving hands. That's when Papa tried to stand up for Mrs. McKenna. Annie said he was sick, could barely walk, but he wouldn't let Mr. Morse hurt the woman who saved us. The memory hit Sarah like a physical blow. Wong Chun, dying and weak, had pulled himself up from the cellar floor and faced down Jacob Morse with nothing but dignity and determination. He'd spoken in broken English, telling Morse to leave the widow alone. Mr. Morse laughed. Annie continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. Said no Chinaman was going to tell him what to do. That's when he pulled his gun. The crowd stirred uneasily. Even the hardest men in Cedar Falls had lines they wouldn't cross, and gunning down a sick, unarmed man tested those boundaries. But the gun didn't fire right, Annie said. Misfired or something. Papa grabbed a shovel from the cellar and swung it at Mr. Morse, trying to protect Mrs. McKenna. Sarah remembered the sickening crack of metal against skull, the way Jacob Morse had crumpled like a discarded newspaper. Wong Chun had put everything he had left into that one desperate swing, then collapsed beside his victim. Papa died right there on the kitchen floor. Annie whispered. Last thing he said was, protect the widow woman. Then he was gone. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat. The story was taking a different shape than the one they'd been told, the shape of a dying man's sacrifice rather than a cold-blooded murder. Mrs. McKenna. She tried to help Papa, but it was too late. Then she looked at Mr. Morse, and he was bleeding real bad from his head. She tried to help him too, but he was already dying. Then how'd he end up in her barn? Mayor Hutchins called out, Dead men don't walk themselves to barns. Annie's face went pale, but she didn't flinch. Mrs. McKenna knew nobody would believe a Chinese man killed a white man in self-defense. Not even to protect a white woman. So she moved the body. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the part that had condemned her, the part that made her look guilty to 12 white men who decided her fate without hearing the whole truth. She dragged him to the barn, tried to make it look like he'd been killed there instead of in the house, cleaned up the blood, hid Papa's body in the mine shaft where nobody would find it. But she wasn't thinking clear. Grief and fear make people do desperate things. Sheriff Bradley's face was troubled as a storm sky. And you saw all this, child? Every bit of it. Mrs. McKenna made me promise to stay quiet. Said it would be safer for everyone if folks thought Mr. Morse was killed by robbers or claim jumpers. She was trying to protect me, just like Papa died trying to protect her. The auctioneer Blackwood stepped forward, his business instincts warring with the crowd's changing mood. Pretty story, Sheriff, but it's still just the word of a Chinese child against established fact. The woman was tried and convicted by a jury that never knew Wong Chun existed, and he shot back, by men who didn't want to hear about claim jumping and murder because it might hurt their own gold interests. That accusation hit the crowd like a slap across the face. Half the men in Cedar Falls had bought claims through Jacob Morse, and questions about his methods threatened their own fortunes. Robert Morse pushed forward again, his face red with rage and fear. Even if this story's true, the woman still moved a body and obstructed justice. That's crimes enough to hang for. Maybe so, Sheriff Bradley said slowly, but it ain't murder, and murder's what she was convicted of. Sarah felt something shift in the crowd, not quite mercy, but doubt. Doubt about Jacob Morse's character, doubt about the trial's fairness, doubt about whether hanging a widow for trying to protect a dying Chinese man served any kind of justice at all. But doubt wasn't enough to cut a noose, and Sarah could see in the faces around her that most folks would rather hang an innocent woman than admit their town was built on blood money and stolen claims. The rope still scratched against her neck, and the auction block still waited for the highest bidder to pull the lever that would drop her into eternity. Sheriff Bradley stood silent as a gravestone, weighing Annie's words against 20 years of keeping peace in a town that valued gold more than truth. Around the platform, faces that had been eager for entertainment now showed the uncomfortable expressions of people forced to examine their own consciences. Well, Sheriff, Blackwood's voice carried the edge of a man watching his profits slip away. Story or no story, we got a legal execution to carry out. Folks came to see justice done. Justice. The word fell from Bradley's lips like a stone into still water. Funny how that word means different things to different people. Robert Morse pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with desperation and drink. My brother was murdered. This China girl's lies don't change that fact. Don't change the fact that your brother was running claim jumpers through the territory either, Bradley said quietly. Been hearing whispers about that for months. The crowd stirred like cattle sensing a storm. Half the men present had bought claims through Jacob Morse, and questions about his business practices threatened every gold strike in the county. Prove it, Morse snarled. You got evidence, or just the word of a dying Chinaman and the woman who killed my brother? Annie stepped forward, her small voice cutting through the tension like a blade. There's proof. Papa kept records of every claim that was stolen, every miner that was driven off or killed. Hid them where Mr. Morse couldn't find them. Sarah's heart stopped. Wong Chun had been more than a simple miner. He'd been keeping track of the systematic theft that was bleeding the territory dry. If his records existed, they could expose corruption that reached from Cedar Falls to the territorial capital. Where? Sheriff Bradley's question carried the weight of a man who'd suspected the truth for years, but lacked the evidence to act. The old McKenna mine shaft, Annie said, where Mrs. McKenna laid Papa to rest. He made me promise to show the law if anything happened to him. Blackwood stepped forward, his showman's instincts recognizing a crowd turning against him. Sheriff, this is getting out of hand. We got a legal hanging to conduct, and these delays are costing money. Bradley's voice cut like a whip. Always comes back to money, don't it, Blackwood? How much you getting paid for this show? How much per rope, per scream, per drop? The auctioneer's face went pale as bone china. I'm a legitimate businessman, conducting legal proceedings. You're a vulture in a fancy coat, feeding on death and calling it justice. Bradley turned to the crowd. How many of you really want to watch a woman hang for protecting a dying man? How many think that's the kind of justice Cedar Falls should be known for? Murmurs rippled through the gathered faces. Some showed shame, others defiance, but doubt was spreading like wildfire through dry grass. Mayor Hutchins stepped forward, his political instincts sensing which way the wind was blowing. Sheriff Bradley, while this child's testimony is interesting, we can't simply ignore a legal conviction based on new stories. There are procedures. $50. Robert Morse's shout cut through the mayor's careful words. $50 to pull that lever. Justice for my brother. The crowd fell silent. $50 was more money than most men saw in 6 months. enough to buy a small ranch or set up a business in town. 60, called a voice from the back. Frank Morrison pushed forward, his eyes bright with greed and bloodlust. $60. Sarah felt the rope tighten around her neck as the platform groaned under shifting weight. The bidding had begun again, and Annie's testimony was being drowned out by the sound of coin and the promise of spectacle. 75. Robert Morse raised his hand high. My brother's killer swings today, no matter what lies that China girl tells. Annie's face crumpled with despair. She'd risked everything to tell the truth, but truth was no match for blood money and mob justice. She took a step back, then another, until she was pressed against the platform's edge. That's when Sarah saw something that made her blood freeze. 3 men were moving through the crowd toward Annie, rough-looking strangers who'd arrived in town with Robert Morse. Claimed jumpers, by the look of them, come to make sure no inconvenient witnesses survived the day. Annie, Sarah shouted, fighting against her bonds. Run! But the girl was trapped between the platform and the pressing crowd. The 3 men closed in like wolves on a wounded deer, their hands moving toward concealed weapons. Sheriff Bradley saw the movement and stepped forward, his own gun clearing leather. That's far enough, boys. The child's under my protection. Old man, you're making a mistake, one of the strangers said, his voice flat as a rattlesnake's belly. This ain't your fight. Child's in my town, speaking to my people. That makes it my fight. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. 3 armed men against 1 aging sheriff, with a crowd of civilians caught between them. Sarah could see how this would end. Blood on the platform, Annie silenced forever, and the truth buried with the bodies. $100. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square, trying to restart the bidding and distract from the brewing gunfight. Do I hear $100 for the honor of justice? Stop this. Annie's voice rose above the chaos, high and desperate. I can prove everything. The records are real. Mrs. McKenna never killed nobody. One of the strangers stepped closer, his hand on his gun butt. Shut your mouth, China girl, before somebody shuts it permanent. That's when Sarah made her choice. She'd lived her whole life, trying to do right by God and her neighbors, trying to follow the law and trust in justice. But justice was about to fail, and an innocent child was about to pay the price for telling the truth. She threw herself sideways off the platform. The rope snapped taut, then snapped completely as her full weight hit it at an angle. Sarah crashed to the ground hard enough to rattle her teeth, but she was alive, and the noose was broken. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some rushed forward to help her, others to stop her, while the 3 strangers drew their guns and Sheriff Bradley shouted for order. Through the confusion, Sarah saw Annie break free and run toward the edge of town, toward the old mine shaft, where Wong Chen's body lay with the evidence that could expose Jacob Morse's crimes and clear Sarah's name. But first, they'd have to survive the next 5 minutes. Gunshots cracked across the square like thunder, and Sarah McKenna rolled behind the auction platform as bullets splintered the wood above her head. The price of truth was always higher than anyone wanted to pay, but some prices couldn't be negotiated. Sheriff Bradley's gun barked twice, dropping one of the strangers before the man could clear leather. The other 2 scattered like startled crows, using the panicking crowd for cover as they returned fire. Women screamed, children cried, and men dove for whatever shelter they could find in the chaos. Sarah rolled under the platform as bullets chewed through the wooden planks above her head. Her hands were still bound, but the fall had loosened the ropes enough that she could work her wrists. Blood from rope burns made her fingers slippery, but desperation gave her strength. There! Robert Morse's voice cut through the gunfire. The murderess, which is trying to escape. More shots rang out, these from townspeople who'd convinced themselves that Sarah's escape proved her guilt. She crawled toward the back of the platform, splinters cutting her face, and hands as bullets searched for her in the shadows. A small hand grabbed her shoulder. Annie had circled back, her young face streaked with tears and dirt. "This way, Mrs. McKenna. I know where we can hide." They ran through Cedar Fall's back alleys, like foxes ahead of hounds. Behind them, voices shouted orders and curses, while boots pounded on wooden sidewalks. The whole town had turned out to hunt them, driven by fear that their comfortable lies might be exposed. Annie led them to a creek that ran behind the Chinese camp, or what was left of it. Blackened tent poles stuck up from the ground like broken bones, and the smell of old smoke still hung in the air like a funeral shroud. "The mine's just up the canyon," Annie gasped, pointing toward a cleft in the rocks where Sarah's late husband had dug for gold in happier times. "Papa's there, and the papers too." They climbed through loose rock and thorny brush, their hands bleeding from sharp stones. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Men on horseback now, covering ground faster than two women on foot could manage. The mine entrance yawned before them like a mouth full of darkness. Sarah had avoided this place since Daniel's death, unable to face the memories that lived in those tunnels. Now it might be her only sanctuary, or her tomb. Annie lit a candle stub she'd carried in her pocket, its weak flame pushing back shadows that seemed to reach for them with grasping fingers. They moved deeper into the earth, following passages Daniel had carved with his own hands. "Here." Annie stopped beside a pile of rocks that looked natural but wasn't. "Papa's resting place." Together they moved the stones, revealing Wang Chen's body wrapped in a Chinese burial shroud. Beside him lay a leather satchel, protected from moisture by oiled cloth and desperate hope. Sarah opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were dozens of documents, claim deeds, bills of sale, correspondence between Jacob Morse and territorial officials. Evidence of a conspiracy that stretched from Cedar Falls to Denver, involving judges, land commissioners, and railroad interests. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, "he documented everything." "Papa said Americans only respect what's written down," Annie replied. "So he wrote it all down, every crime, every stolen claim, every murdered miner." Footsteps echoed from the mine entrance. Their pursuers had found them. Sarah clutched the satchel to her chest, knowing it contained not just her salvation, but the potential ruin of half the territory's political structure. "Sarah McKenna." Robert Morse's voice boomed through the tunnels. "Come out and face justice like a Christian woman." "Justice?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Your brother stole more gold than most men see in 10 lifetimes, and killed anyone who got in his way. Where's the justice in that? He was cleaning up the territory, getting rid of heathens and troublemakers." Morse's voice grew closer. "You killed a good man." "I killed nobody." Sarah shouted back. "Your brother died because a sick, dying Chinese man fought to protect a widow woman's honor. That's more goodness than Jacob ever showed in his whole miserable life." Light flickered in the tunnel ahead, torches carried by men with guns and ropes. Sarah counted at least 6 voices, maybe more. Too many to fight, too many to reason with. "Mrs. McKenna," Annie whispered, "there's another way out. Papa showed me. But you got to choose. Save yourself, or stay and fight for the truth." Sarah looked at the satchel in her hands, then at the young girl who'd risked everything to clear her name. Wang Chun had died protecting her. Annie had spoken up knowing it might mean her own death. How many more innocents would suffer if Jacob Morse's conspiracy remained hidden? "Show me the way out," she said. "But first, we make sure this evidence reaches someone who'll act on it." Annie nodded toward a crack in the rock wall barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Leads to an old Indian cave, comes out by Willow Creek. But they'll catch us if we both go." Sarah understood. One of them had to stay behind, face whatever came, buy time for the other to escape with the truth. "Take the papers." Sarah pressed the satchel into Annie's small hands. "Get them to Sheriff Bradley if he's still alive. If not, take them to the territorial judge in Denver. I ain't leaving you." Tears streamed down Annie's dirt-stained cheeks. "You saved me and Papa. I won't let you die for it." "Child, some things are worth dying for. Justice, truth, the chance for other folks to live free of men like Jacob Morse." Sarah cupped Annie's face with gentle hands. "Your papa understood that. Now you got to understand it too." The torch light grew brighter. Voices echoed closer. Time was running out like sand through an hourglass. "Go," Sarah said. "Live. Testify. Make sure the world knows what really happened here." Annie squeezed through the crack in the rock, the satchel clutched against her chest. As she disappeared into darkness, Sarah heard her whisper, "I'll make them remember. I promise." Sarah turned to face the approaching lights, empty-handed but not empty-hearted. She'd saved one innocent life, preserved evidence of terrible crimes, and given truth a fighting chance in a world that preferred comfortable lies. The torches rounded the corner, revealing Robert Morse and 5 hard-faced men carrying ropes and hatred in equal measure, their eyes fixed on her like wolves spotting wounded prey. "Where's the China girl?" Morse demanded. "Gone where you can't hurt her," Sarah replied. "We'll see about that. But first, you got an appointment with a rope." They advanced with the confidence of men who'd never faced real opposition, who'd built their power on the backs of the weak and defenseless. They expected Sarah to cower, to beg, to break like so many others had broken. Instead, she smiled. "You boys seem awful eager to hang an innocent woman. Makes a person wonder what you're really afraid of." The first man who reached for her learned that a widow who'd survived 3 years alone on the frontier had claws of her own. Sarah McKenna went down fighting, taking 2 of them with her, buying precious minutes for a young Chinese girl to carry the truth toward the light. Hours later, when Annie Chen stumbled into Sheriff Bradley's office with Wong Chen's evidence, the old lawman read through the documents with growing amazement and rage. By morning, telegraphs were flying toward Denver, arrest warrants were being written, and the territorial judge was dispatching federal marshals to investigate. Sarah McKenna died in that mine, but the truth lived on. Jacob Morse's conspiracy collapsed under the weight of documentary evidence. His co-conspirators fled or faced trial, and the stolen claims were returned to their rightful owners. Annie Chen was taken in by a Chinese family in San Francisco, where she grew up to become a teacher and civil rights advocate. She never forgot the widow who saved her, or the promise she'd made in that dark cave. Years later, when the territory became a state and laws changed to allow Chinese testimony in court, Annie returned to Cedar Falls. She testified before a congressional committee investigating frontier corruption, ensuring that Sarah McKenna's sacrifice became part of the official record. Justice had come at last, carried by a child's courage and a widow's willingness to pay the ultimate price for truth. In the end, that might be the only kind of justice that ever really matters, the kind that costs everything, but saves something precious for those who come after. The mine shaft became Sarah's unmarked grave, but her legacy lived in every honest deed, every act of mercy, every moment when someone chose to do right regardless of the cost. Some debts can only be paid with blood, but some truths are worth any price at all.